Okay, we're going to hear first a few words about Psych-Hi.
Hi everybody, I'm going to tell you just quickly about Psych-Hi. It is the Honor Society in Psychology, and we do a lot of fun professional and social events like Professor Breakfast, GSI Mixers, movie nights, pizza nights, and resume workshops. So it's a good mix of both professional events and also social events. We're having our first information session tonight from 5 to 6 in the Beach Room, which is 3105 Tolman. And we're having a second information session this Thursday the 6th from 6 to 7 in 3105 Tolman. So again, it's tonight from 5 to 6 and then Thursday from 6 to 7. And our applications will be due next Thursday the 13th outside our office door, 3301 Tolman at 5 p.m. Any questions? Cool, thank you.
So Psych-Hi is the National Honor Society in Psychology. There was no chapter of Psych-Hi at Berkeley a few years ago. I was department chair. A few students approached me and said, let's start a chapter. And within a year, we were the fastest growing chapter in America. Because when you start from zero, any change is big. And now there's a lot of students in Psych-Hi. You have to have a certain GPA in the major to be a member. You can get the application form. Once you're in, you're a lifetime member. You don't have to do much, but if you do a lot, it's a really good social, professional, community service set of things to do in addition to having a nice thing in your resume that you're a National Honor Student. So that's Psych-Hi. So tonight in the Beach Room and another one Thursday, and the applications are outside the Psych-Hi door. So today, we're going to talk about genes. So this is sort of a genetics lecture, but as it turns out, it's really a transactional lecture because genes do not operate in isolation. That's the theme today. Genes and the environments in which we grow up, the environments inside our bodies, the environments in our families and in our culture are all part of a transactional mix. So it was only 13 years ago that scientists, both at the NIH and Craig Ventner's venture capital firm, decoded the human DNA molecules. 3 billion base pairs in the nucleus of every cell in your body. All that genetic material, all those nucleotides, and those nucleotides divide up into 23 chromosomes, and on some big chromosomes like the X chromosome, there's a lot of genes, 1,000 or 2,000, and on the Y chromosome, sorry guys, there's about 38 genes. The Y chromosome, one of the big debates in evolutionary biology, has it almost bred itself out of existence, but the recent data are the Y chromosomes hanging in there. Guys are going to be around for a while. So what are genes? They're a bunch of DNA units that serve a functional purpose. They link up with messenger RNA, and transcription and translation occur, and they make proteins. And what are neurotransmitters? Transmitters made of proteins. What are receptors in the brain made of? Proteins. So DNA through RNA becomes the building block of brains and bodies, and you know the story from high school biology, et cetera, et cetera. What about the rest of the DNA, the 90+% of DNA that's not part of a gene? Well, it's called the dark matter. People thought, well, it's kind of junk DNA. Turns out to be it's essential for making the genes do what they do. So evolution didn't create 95% of DNA to kind of have no function, but that's a big area in molecular biology now. So for this class, the big issue is, are genes a risk factor? Or I guess, given what we said the other day, a vulnerability. Because you're born with your genes, they're there for the rest of your life, they don't change, how genes express or change. So we probably think of a genetic predisposition as a vulnerability rather than a risk factor, although they really mean the same thing as we talked about, meaning what? The genes come before you have a bad outcome, because you're born with those genes, and do certain genetic configurations predict that bad outcome. So they be risk factors, or in this case, vulnerabilities, because they're so early appearing and long-lasting. So for a long time, the only field we had was called behavior genetics, and we'll talk about that starting in the next slide. But now that we actually know how the DNA divides up and what genes are, and more what they do, we have molecular genetics. So it's actually specific genes, not just tendencies in the population. So what is behavior genetics? It's really the study of heritability and the study of how environments interact with heritability, but we got to define this term first. So this is misused in the newspaper and in Time magazine and in Newsweek, although I think Newsweek went defunct, and in Rolling Stone all the time. People get heritability wrong. So you could give me a personality scale. It's very confidential, but I'll share it with you. And so you can see my items. Do I like my shoes in neat rows in my closet? Would I rather keep my kitchen organized than go to a party, right? So you can get my scores on that. You might see how conscientious I am or how neurotic I am. So let's just take conscientiousness, one of those big 5 personality traits. And maybe I score at the 85th percentile. Steve's kind of conscientious. Not a big fun-loving guy, but help him get good grades. So what part of my conscientiousness is a function of my genes, and what part of my conscientiousness is a function of my environment? Don't answer the question because it has no answer. It's 100% of both. Any common trait you have, how tall you are, how conscientious you are, it's 100% genetic, 100% environmental. What did high school biology tell you? The phenotype is the genotype as expressed by the environment. So you can't separate out for me or for you, but you could say, why is Steve at only the 50th percentile of height? Damn it. If I'd been 90th, I'd have been a bigger force on the basketball court. And why is he at the 85th on conscientiousness? Why is he more obsessive than a lot of other people? That is a question you can answer. It's talking about differences. It's talking about differences across people. It's talking about variability. So we look at a bell curve and we say, why is Steve right in the middle on height? But why is he pretty high on conscientiousness or whatever trait? Are the differences in people across height, conscientiousness, depression, schizophrenia, if we get into psychology, are those differences mainly caused by genes, mainly caused by environments, or some combination? So heritability is just a percentage. If all of the differences across people are caused by genes, what is that trait or condition? It's 100% heritable. But if all the differences are caused by environments, the heritability is 0%. See the difference? We're not talking about your traits or mine. We're talking about the whole curve. And are genes more important for those producing those differences or environments? And what if heritability were 50%? Well, it's about half and half, right? So how do we know about heritability? Well, we can't yet randomly assign people to get certain genes. Maybe in the future, total genetic engineering, that will happen with humans. That'll be one of the biggest ethical issues of the next century. But for now, we just happen to see, hey, are you related to that person? Are you really related to that person? Are you a clone of that person? Because who are clones? Identical twins. But if you're just a fraternal twin, you're not a clone, you're just like any other sibling, you just happen to be born at the same time. So this is the field of behavior genetics. The methods we use to infer heritability start with family studies. Sometimes these are called pedigree studies. It's pretty simple. If I'm related to you, I probably share more traits with you than if we're completely unrelated. Okay, that makes sense. And the more closely related I am to you, the more genes I share with you, the more we're going to share those traits too. That's the assumption of a family study. Relatives are going to share more traits than non-relatives, and the closeness of relativity, closeness that you're related to somebody, is going to make you share even more, okay? So what do we know? We know that tall people tend to run in families. We know that conscientious people tend to run in families. We could do that for depression. We could do it especially for bipolar disorder, which has a very high heritability. What's the catch? What's the problem? What's the spuriousness of this argument? Well, the more closely related I am to you, I probably spend more time with you. Is it the genes we share or is it the environment we share? Hard to figure out, hard to tease apart. Now, if you get really fancy, what do the behavior geneticists do? You don't need to know this for the exam, but it's kind of intriguing. They do things like study maternal half-siblings versus paternal half-siblings. Same amount of genetic relatedness, but the maternal half-sibling you share the same womb with. And paternal sibling, you just share sperm with, you may not have ever seen the person. So you're trying to tease apart genetic relatedness and family relatedness. Now, the second method is called a twin study, but really it's just a subset of a family study. Because what does a twin study do? It says, okay, you could be a fraternal twin, or you could be an identical twin. So identical twins, monozygotic. And you know what this means. It's the same fertilized egg that happens to split in two. So you're genetically identical. Are identical twins genetically identical? 0.9999999, because there's some random mutations. But for all intents and purposes, identical twins are clones. And what about fraternal twins, dizygotic twins? Two fertilized eggs that just happen to get implanted in the mom's womb at the same time. 50% of their gene share, just like any brother and sister, or brother and brother, but you're born at the same time. So under the assumptions, given this methodology, what should be the case if something's heritable? People who are identical twins should be more alike on that trait than fraternal twins, because they share twice as much genetic material. What's the catch? People, like parents, treat and dress Mike and Ike alike, right? Maybe they share more of an environment than Mike and Susie, because fraternal twins can be brothers and sisters 50% of the time. But then the geneticists would say, but wait a minute, it's really reciprocal, isn't it? Maybe the reason Mike and Ike are dressed alike and talk to alike is because they're so damn similar. Maybe their genetic relatedness predicts them more similar, so it's kind of an infinite circle, isn't it? But the idea is, if something's heritable, identical twins should be a lot more similar than fraternal twins. So here's the fancy talk about this. You look for concordance if you're talking about a disease or a trait. So I have an identical twin. I don't, but assume I did, and I developed depression. Does my co-twin develop depression? If so, we're concordant. We both have this trait or disorder. So what should be the case? The concordance should be twice as high, roughly, in identical twins as fraternal twins if there's heritability, because 100% of genes are shared versus 50%. So if you're interested in the math, here's the real simple math. What's the heritability of schizophrenia? If you've taken Psych 130, you've covered this. What's the concordance for identical twins of schizophrenia? If one twin gets it, does the other? Depends on whether you measure schizophrenia really narrowly or more generally, but the average would be about 50 to 55% concordance. What's the heritability, the concordance of fraternal twins for schizophrenia? It's about 15%, maybe 20. So heritability is take 55%, subtract 20% from it, that's 35, multiply by 2, 0.7. Concordance of monozygotic minus dizygotic, take that difference, multiply by 2. That's your rough estimate of heritability. But it's making the assumption that the similarities are caused by the similar genes, not the similar treatment. Make sense? Got the reasoning? Question? So it's interesting. Depending on how you measure schizophrenia, narrowly or broadly, the concordance for siblings is 10 to 15%. So the concordance for fraternal twins is a little bit higher, because remember, they're the same age, and they might be treated a little more alike. But concordance for identical twins is 50 to 55%. So it's probably genes have something to do with it, but also that early treatment you got too. Make sense? Now, what's the final study? I just sort of talked through at the top of that slide. The final study is adoption studies. Now, these get complicated, but the idea is pretty simple. If you're adopted into a family, you don't share genes with that family. You share genes with your biological family, but you're raised by your adopted family. So if there's heritability, whom would you be more alike? The biological family you've never seen, or the adopted family you're raised with every day? If heritability is high, it's your biological relatives that count, not the people who raised you. So this is done with schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, and conscientiousness and height. And it turns out that for a lot of mental disorders, the genes you share with your bio family, even though they didn't raise you, matters more for whether you develop the condition than your adopted family, even though you spend a lot of time with them. So it's another suggestion that what? The genes matter. Not 100%, but they matter a lot. What would be the best study of all of these, family, twin, or adoption? Well, the best would be identical twins separated at birth and reared on different continents. They share their genes, 100%, and they've been reared by totally different families. There's a few cases of that. And these made the newspapers a couple decades ago when the Minnesota study was published. Here's two identical twins. They were separated at birth. They're raised 3,000 miles apart, and they both put powdered sugar on the outer square of their waffles. Or they both have really similar interests in screwdrivers. I mean, so the newspapers made a big deal of this. There's some surprising similarities across identical twins, even if they're reared apart, which would give you even more evidence that there's heritability. Kind of make sense? This is something you don't need to know, but I think it's really interesting. The last bullet point up at the top, back to twin studies. Bertelson and Gottesman, about 25 years ago, did a really interesting study of schizophrenia, where they found 25 identical twin pairs, one of whom had schizophrenia and the other of whom didn't. So they're discordant for schizophrenia. Now that's pretty interesting, because if the heritability for schizophrenia is 60 or 70%, it'd be pretty rare to find two identical twins, one of whom has schizophrenia, the other doesn't. It must be something environmental, right? What did they find in 24 of the 25 twin pairs? The twin who developed schizophrenia was born second, or at a lower birth weight, or with more birth complications. So now you think the twins had the identical genetic material. They both were vulnerable, but it took early environments, like low birth weight or birth complications, to trigger the schizophrenia in only one of the twins. 24 out of 25, that was a very significant finding. So what's interesting is that behavior genetic studies often tell you as much about the environment as they do about genes. Questions about this? This is a world record, speed record for going through behavior genetics. Family studies, twin studies, adoption studies. Get the methodology? Is it perfect? No. Because again, maybe environments for identical twins are more similar than for fraternal, just the way the genes are more similar, and because we can't randomly assign, it's not perfect. Now, what's the problem with adoption studies even further? If you're, quote, given up for adoption, what kind of families do you go to? You go to families that meet the criteria of the adoption agency. So, if you're adopted away early, the variance in the families to which you might be adopted isn't very strong. So adoption studies may bias toward high heritability. Because if you really wanted to do a good adoption study, you would have kids adopted into the poorest of homes and the richest of homes, and Asia and the United States. But adoption environments are a little more similar, so we don't know the effects of the environment as much from adoption studies as we should. If you get that, that means you're thinking. Now, what's the overall conclusion? When you do twin and adoption studies, what's the heritability of just about all of the big 5 personality traits? At least 50%. Conscientiousness and neuroticism and how much you love poetry and are open to experience. That's have to do with the genes you were born with, not just the family environment you were in. So a lot of things are more heritable than we'd think. What about for mental health? Well, we'll talk about this later in the course when we talk about autism and ADHD, but ADHD, to sort of let the cat out of the bag, is at least 70% heritable. Bipolar disorder, at least 80%, and the best estimates, autism, at least 90%. Genes have a lot to do with the risk for some of the disorders we'll talk about. We're out of the era 50 years ago, the psychoanalytic era, where it was all poor parenting or toilet training problems, etc. Much more genetic, but it's not that simple. Stay awake, stay tuned. Here's a couple of issues about heritability that you really need to know. Who knows what PKU is? Phenylketonuria. What is phenylketonuria? Somebody explain it quickly. One at a time. Yes? So you're born with this condition called PKU, phenylketonuria, and if you're born with it, you can't metabolize phenylalanine. That's why Diet Coke can say contains phenylalanine. If you have PKU, don't drink a Diet Coke, right? What's the cause of PKU? Back to high school bio. It's a recessive disorder. Remember, parent one's a carrier, big allele, little allele. Parent two's, it's like Mendel and his peas, smooth and wrinkled. So mom and dad, right? Mom's a carrier, dad's a carrier. What are the chances you get the double recessive if mom and dad are both carriers? 25%, right? Double dominant, mix, heterozygote, and the double recessive. So that's what PKU is. It's a recessive condition, and if you get both little alleles, your body cannot metabolize phenylalanine and other essential amino acids. And if you can't, then toxic levels build up in your brain. And what's the average IQ of somebody with PKU when they're 10? About 55 or 60. You're in the moderately retarded range, so it leads to serious mental retardation or intellectual disability. What's the heritability of PKU? 100%. It's a pure genetic disorder. There's a single gene. If you've got the double recessive, you have PKU. If you don't, you don't. So it's 100% heritable, right? See what heritability is? All the stuff we talk about in this course, there's many genes. They sum up over time. But PKU, 100% heritable. You got the double recessive, bing. If you don't, you don't. How do we treat PKU? You don't drink Diet Cokes. You don't have phenylalanine and other chemicals in your diet. What's the average IQ of a PKU baby at age 10 if they've had a phenylalanine restricted diet? About 100. Normal intelligence. Something can be 100% heritable. It's all genetic, and we treat it environmentally, in this case through the diet. So just because something is 100% heritable doesn't mean, well, the only thing we can do is replace those genes. Now, gene replacement therapy is happening for Duchenne muscular dystrophy and some forms of cystic fibrosis now, single gene disorders, not for PKU yet. But the point here is that even if something's 100% heritable, maybe the gene isn't always the place you have to treat it. You could treat the downstream environment that prevents the gene from expressing itself. Make sense? If something's really heritable, well then, it's a fixed trait. What's the heritability of height? Why am I not 6'4"? Damn it. The heritability of height's 92%. My parents had little average lousy height genes, right in the middle of the bell curve, and so am I. So height never changes. Why are we 3.5 inches taller than our great-grandparents? Nutrition, fat content, hormones, proteins. A very heritable trait can change in the whole population over time if the environment changes. Think about this. Don't read the newspaper headlines that make you think it's all heritable. It's only genetic. It's genetic determinism. It's not so fast. Here's a third thing that's really interesting. What's the heritability of IQ scores? Now, we could spend a whole lecture on what is IQ, what is intelligence. Do IQ tests measure intelligence? It's a big deal. But whatever IQ is, what's its heritability? About 60%. Something about the genes you inherit from your parents predict a lot of the variation in do you score high on IQ tests or medium or low. But Eric Turkheimer, our colleague at Virginia, published a paper in 2001 that turned everything on its head. He said, I'm not so sure this is true. In fact, I'm going to look at all of the twin studies on IQ scores around the world, and I'm going to break them down by whether the kid grew up in a rich home, a middle-class home, or a poor home. And what did he find? And he divided it into 5 levels. In the highest social class, the heritability of IQ was about 80%. In the lowest social class, the heritability of IQ was about 25%. What? I thought it was all about genes. How could heritability be high for rich kids and low for poor kids? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Yes? Right, so if I'm a rich kid, I'm sort of stereotyping here. If I'm a rich kid, how many ways can I have 500 channels? How many swimming pools can I have? How many books can I have in the home? Above a certain level, the environments are all the same, and the differences are predicted by my genes. But if I grow up in utter poverty, malnutrition, toxic stress, abuse, neglect, there's a lot of environmental things that can impinge upon my cognitive ability. So environments are relatively much more important for poor kids than for rich kids in terms of IQ. Does that make sense? If that makes sense, it should cause you to not think that IQ and its heritability mean that genes are destiny. It's much more complicated than that. Final one, what's the heritability of aggressive behavior in 2-year-olds? It's really low. Why? Most 2-year-olds, especially boys, are pretty damn aggressive, right? It's just part of the species. What's the heritability of serious